The moment you stop reacting is the moment the game starts to fall apart. There comes a moment, subtle at first, almost invisible, when the dynamic begins to shift. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface. There is no argument, no clear breaking point. But internally, something has changed within you. Where you once reacted, you now observe. Where you once explained yourself, you now remain still. And in that stillness, the entire structure that once held the connection together begins to weaken. What's important to understand is that this shift is not about becoming cold or distant. It is about becoming conscious. You begin to see patterns instead of isolated incidents. You recognize that certain emotional responses were not accidental, but part of a repeating cycle. And once you see the pattern clearly, you can no longer participate in it unconsciously. This is the moment she senses something is different. Not because you've said it, but because she feels the absence of what once was. The emotional reactions she relied on are no longer available. The tension she once created no longer produces the same effect. And in psychological terms, this is deeply unsettling for anyone who died. EP ends on predictable responses to maintain control. Your silence, your calmness, your refusal to engage in unnecessary conflict introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty disrupts control. But here is where most people misunderstand their own strength. Strength is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not seek validation. True strength is quiet, grounded, and consistent. It is the ability to remain centered when everything around you is trying to pull you back into chaos. And once you reach that point, something irreversible happens. You stop being someone who can be managed and start becoming someone who must be faced. And that is the moment everything begins to change. Once that inner shift takes place, it doesn't go unnoticed. In fact, it creates a kind of psychological tension that is difficult to ignore, because when you stop participating in a familiar emotional pattern, the other person is forced to confront something they may have been avoiding: the loss of influence. And for someone who has relied on that influence to maintain stability, your growth does not feel neutral. It feels threatening. This is where your strength begins to reveal its true nature, not as dominance, not as resistance, but as detachment from what once controlled you. You are no longer pulled by every emotional current. You don't rush to fix, to explain, or to prove yourself. And in doing so, you remove the very mechanism that sustained the dynamic. Psychologically, this creates a kind of imbalance. When one person evolves beyond a pattern and the other remains anchored in it, tension is inevitable. Your calmness becomes unfamiliar. Your boundaries feel like rejection. Your silence is interpreted not as peace but as distance. And so what you experience as clarity, the other may experience as loss. It's important to understand this without turning it into blame. This is not about labeling someone as the problem. It is about recognizing that when your identity is no longer defined by reaction, you disrupt any system that depended on it. Growth, in this sense, is inherently confrontational, not because it attacks, but because it exposes. And exposure is uncomfortable. It forces a person to either adapt or intensify their efforts to restore what was lost. That is why your strength often triggers a reaction. Not because it is aggressive, but because it is no longer available for manipulation. And when your presence can no longer be controlled, it becomes something far more powerful, something that demands to be reckoned with. As this tension builds, the dynamic often enters its most revealing phase. When subtle influence no longer produces results, escalation becomes the next step, not necessarily in obvious or overt ways, but through carefully timed emotional pressure. You may notice a sudden shift, an unexpected outburst, a return to past grievances, or a wave of vulnerability that feels almost theatrical in its intensity. These moments are not random. They are attempts to re-establish a familiar emotional rhythm. From a psychological standpoint, this is a form of provocation. The aim is not resolution, but reaction, because if you can be drawn back into defending yourself, explaining yourself, or emotionally engaging at the same level as before, then the previous dynamic is restored. The structure regains its balance not through understanding, but through your participation. What makes this stage particularly complex is that it often disguises itself as something meaningful. It may appear as honesty, as emotional openness, even as a desire to reconnect. And this is where many people become confused. They respond not to the pattern, but to the presentation. They interpret intensity as sincerity and urgency as importance. But when you step back and observe without immediately reacting, a different picture emerges. You begin to see that the timing of these moments is not coincidental. They arise precisely when your distance becomes noticeable, when your independence starts to solidify. In that sense, the behavior is less about connection and more about restoring control. This is the final test of your awareness. Not whether you understand what is happening, but whether you can remain grounded while it unfolds. Because once you see the pattern clearly, the question is no longer about them. It becomes about you. Will you return to what is familiar or remain aligned with what is true? Because the moment you refuse to react is the moment the pattern loses its power. At this stage, the situation becomes less about what is being said and more about what is being tested. The surface may look like conflict, misunderstanding, or emotional intensity, but beneath it lies something far more precise, a deliberate attempt to see whether you will abandon your center. This is where many people falter, not because they lack awareness, but because they underestimate the pressure of familiarity. There is a psychological pull toward what is known, even when it is dysfunctional. Old patterns carry a strange sense of comfort because they are predictable. You know how the conversation unfolds, how the tension rises, how it resolves temporarily. And so when you are drawn back into that environment, there is a subtle temptation to respond in the same way you always have, not consciously, but almost reflexively. This is what it means to be pulled out of character. Not your social persona, but your higher awareness, the part of you that has already seen through the pattern. The moment you react impulsively, defend yourself emotionally, or try to reassert control through argument, you step back into the very cycle you had begun to outgrow. And this is why the test is so effective. It doesn't require force. It only requires you to forget, even briefly, what you have already understood. To remain grounded in this moment requires more than knowledge. It requires discipline, the ability to pause when provoked, to observe, when accused, to remain silent when silence is the most powerful response. Not out of avoidance, but out of clarity. Because true strength is not proven when things are calm. It is revealed when you are challenged to become what you once were and choose not to. And in that choice, you either reinforce your growth or quietly surrender it. If you've come this far, you begin to realize that power is not found in a single moment of resistance, but in sustained consistency. Anyone can remain calm once. Anyone can hold a boundary briefly. But the real transformation occurs when that behavior becomes your default, when it no longer requires effort to stay aligned with what you know is right. This is where many people misunderstand the nature of strength. They associate it with confrontation, with proving a point, with winning an exchange. But psychological strength operates differently. It is quiet, repetitive, almost unremarkable on the surface. It shows itself in the decisions you make daily, the things you choose not to engage with, the arguments you no longer entertain, the explanations you no longer feel compelled to give. Consistency removes ambiguity. It sends a clear message, not through words, but through pattern. When your behavior no longer fluctuates based on someone else's emotional state, you become stable in a way that cannot be easily influenced. And that stability disrupts any dynamic that depends on unpredictability or reaction. There is also a deeper shift that takes place within you. You stop seeking resolution through external validation. You no longer need the other person to understand you in order to remain grounded. This is a significant psychological evolution because it frees you from the endless loop of trying to be seen, heard, or acknowledged by someone who may not be capable of offering it in a healthy way. In that sense, your consistency becomes your boundary, not something you declare, but something you embody. And over time, this has a profound effect. Either the dynamic adapts to meet your level of clarity, or it begins to dissolve under the weight of its own inefficiency. Because what cannot control you eventually loses its hold on you. And so you arrive at a quiet but decisive threshold, one that doesn't announce itself with certainty, but reveals itself through consequence. By this point, the pattern has exposed its, if fully. The reactions, the escalations, the attempts to draw you back, they have all played their part. What remains is no longer a question of understanding, but of direction. Because from here, there are only two paths forward. Either the dynamic begins to lose its structure, gradually dissolving as it fails to produce the responses it once depended on, or it resets, repeating itself in a familiar cycle the moment you re-engage in the old way. And this is the part that demands honesty, not about the other person, but about yourself. Awareness on its own is not transformation. You can see the pattern clearly and still choose to step back into it. Not because you are weak, but because the pull of familiarity is strong, and the desire for resolution can be even stronger. There is always that quiet thought, maybe this time it will be different. Asterisk, but without a fundamental shift in behavior, different outcomes remain unlikely. What defines the outcome now is not what is said, or promised, or even felt in the moment. It is what you consistently do. Your actions either reinforce the clarity you've gained, or they quietly undo it. And this is where true responsibility begins, not in changing someone else, but in no longer abandoning yourself in the process. Because freedom in its most practical form is not given, it is maintained. It is the result of repeated choices that align with what you already know to be true. And in the end, the question is no longer whether the pattern will continue, it is whether you will.